When the news broke that Phil Robertson had taken his last breath, his family expected heartbreak. But they never expected what came next. The man who spent his life preaching simplicity, faith, and discipline left behind something far more complicated than anyone imagined. And when the lawyer finally opened the envelope containing his final instructions, every member of the Robertson family fell silent. They had prepared themselves for grief, but nothing prepared them for the legacy Phil left written in his own hand, the final days of a tough man. In the months leading up to May 2025, Phil Robertson's health declined in a way that none of his children were emotionally prepared to confront the man they had always known as unshakable, the man who hunted through storms, preached with conviction, and lived by his own uncompromising code, was beginning to slip away when the family publicly revealed in December 2024 that Phil had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Most fans assumed it meant years of gradual decline, but the reality inside the Robertson home was far more painful. The progression of the disease was devastatingly fast, attacking not only his memory but his physical strength. In the early months, the changes were subtle. Misplaced objects, repeated questions, long pauses in conversations. But before long, the forgetfulness transformed into full episodes of disorientation. Phil sometimes struggled to recall the day of the week, or he would begin a story and forget halfway through what he wanted to say. These were small but frightening reminders that the man who had built an empire with his hands and stood firm through decades of controversy was now fighting a battle he could not win. By April 2025, the family could no longer hide the truth. On an episode of the Unashamed podcast, Jace spoke with a mixture of honesty and heartbreak. "He's not good," he admitted. "We're making him comfortable." Those few words told the world what the family had been quietly enduring. Phil Robertson, the patriarch, the leader, the voice of faith and tradition, was fading. His body grew weaker. Simple routines required assistance. His voice, once strong and steady, softened to the point where even speaking for long periods exhausted him. The disease was not just affecting his mind, it was affecting everything. Yet in the middle of this decline, Phil remained remarkably calm. He had spoken about death for years, never with fear, always with certainty. To him, death was not an ending, but a transition. "Don't cry when I die," he would tell his children. "Dance, sing, but don't cry." He said it so often that it almost became a family motto, something he expected them to follow when the time came. But when his final day arrived, none of them were able to obey those words. In the early hours of May 25, 2025, Phil passed away at home, surrounded by those who loved him most. He was 79. The moment was quiet, but the weight of it was enormous. His son Jace was the first to share the news publicly. "My dad has gone to be with the Lord today." Willie and Corey followed with a message filled with equal parts sadness and gratitude, a reminder that while they mourned his loss, they were thankful for every year they had been given with him. The funeral that followed was exactly the kind Phil would have wanted. There were no reporters, no cameras waiting outside, no politicians trying to attach themselves to the moment, just family, close friends, and the kind of silence that only comes from decades of shared life. They prayed, they remembered, and they tried to honor his request not to cry. But most failed. The grief was too heavy, the love too deep, but it wasn't the funeral that finally broke the family. It was what came immediately after. When they gathered in the lawyer's office to hear Phil's final words, the will, the handwritten letters, the decisions he made long before his mind began to fade. That was the moment when the tears truly came. Because for the first time, they realized Phil's final days were not just about dying. They were about preparing his family for life without him. The will that shattered the room. The reading of Phil Robertson's will took place the day after the funeral. behind the closed doors of a lawyer's office in West Monroe. Present were Miss Kay, his wife of more than 50 years, their sons Alan, Jace, Willie, and Jep, and Phyllis, the daughter Phil discovered late in life, but embraced wholeheartedly. What they expected was a simple division of assets. What they received was something far more intimate and overwhelming. Phil had prepared handwritten letters for each member of his family, no assistants, no typed pages, no rehearsed statements. Just Phil's own handwriting, uneven, shaky from illness, but unmistakably his. These letters weren't financial instructions. They were confessions, apologies, blessings, and final attempts to guide the people he loved. Each envelope contained not only a portion of his estate, but a personal message explaining why he gave it, what he hoped they would do with it, and how he wanted each of them to continue his legacy. His net worth, estimated between $10 million and $15 million, came from decades of work: Duck Commander, Duck Dynasty, book deals, licensing, and years of conservative podcasting and speaking. But the real shock wasn't the money. It was the meaning behind every allocation. Miss Kay received full ownership of the family estate, a place they had built together from the days when they were eating food from the swamp just to get by. Alan, the former pastor, received Phil's lifelong collection of religious writings. Jace and Jep received proportional shares of Duck Commander, with responsibilities Phil described as guarding the tradition. Phyllis received land and a handwritten apology for the years she lived not knowing who her father truly was. And then there was Willie, the son who carried Duck Commander into mainstream America, who inherited the controlling stake in the family business, along with a message that said, "Protect the faith, protect the legacy." When the last envelope was opened, tears finally came, not because of what they gained, but because they understood what they had lost, a legacy built in the swamps. To understand why Phil Robertson's will carried such emotional weight, the family had to look back at where everything began. Long before television cameras arrived, before the merchandise lines and book tours, Phil was just a poor boy from Louisiana trying to survive. Born in 1946, he grew up in a home where hunting wasn't a hobby. It was a necessity. His family was so poor that meals often depended on what he could catch in the swamps. That early struggle shaped the man he eventually became: tough, defiant, self-reliant, and deeply skeptical of anything that pulled him away from the land. But Phil wasn't just a swamp kid. He was gifted. His athletic ability earned him a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech, where he became the starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. His backup at the time was none other than Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to become an NFL legend. Most people would have stayed and fought for a professional future. Phil didn't. In one of the most defining decisions of his life, he walked away from football because it interfered with duck season. "I'd rather hunt ducks than have large, violent men stomp me in the dirt," he once said. It sounded humorous, but it was a statement of identity. He valued freedom over fame. In 1972, he turned that freedom into a business. Duck Commander started as a small operation run out of his home, where he hand-carved duck calls and shipped them out one order at a time. Miss Kay, pregnant at 17 and then raising their children, stood beside him through every hardship. For years, they lived with barely enough money to get by, relying on faith and what they could gather from the bayou. But the business grew slowly, then steadily, and eventually explosively when Willie returned from college with a vision to modernize everything. The empire that formed, the empire that later made Phil a multimillionaire, had its roots in poverty, sacrifice, and family unity. That's why the letters in his will were so powerful. Each child wasn't just receiving money. They were receiving a chapter of a story written across generations. Fame, controversy, and the man who would not bend the world did not know Phil Robertson through the swamps of Louisiana or the hardships of his early marriage. They met him in 2012 when Duck Dynasty premiered on A&E. At first, the show was meant to be a simple reality program about a family running a duck call business. Instead, it exploded into a cultural phenomenon. At its peak, more than 11 million viewers tuned in weekly to see the bearded patriarch speak blunt truths about faith, family, and discipline. What people saw on TV wasn't an act. It was the exact man Phil had always been. But fame did not make him gentler. If anything, it made him louder. In 2013, an interview with GQ ignited one of the biggest controversies of his career. Phil spoke bluntly, too bluntly, some believed, about homosexuality and race, saying that gay relationships went against God's design and that Black Americans were happy under Jim Crow laws. The backlash was immediate. A&E suspended him temporarily, advertisers began to distance themselves, and civil rights groups demanded apologies, but conservatives rallied behind him. Hashtags supporting him went viral. Duck Commander merchandise sold out. A&E, overwhelmed by public pressure, reinstated him within weeks. Phil refused to bend. He never apologized, saying his beliefs came directly from Scripture. Over the next decade, he became a fixture in conservative politics. He endorsed Ted Cruz during the 2016 presidential run and later backed Donald Trump. To some, he was a symbol of religious conviction. To others, a symbol of intolerance. Yet Phil seemed unaffected by both admiration and anger. He believed he was doing what God expected, no more and no less. Behind the scenes, however, the family struggled with the weight of that fame. Ratings eventually declined, and Duck Dynasty ended in 2017 after 11 seasons. More spin-offs followed. Going Cyril, Jep and Jessica, At Home with the Robertsons, Duck Family Treasure, and in January 2025, A&E announced that Duck Dynasty, the revival, would return with the next generation. Phil wouldn't be in it. Alzheimer's had already taken too much, but his presence remained the backbone of the franchise. His convictions, controversies, and choices shaped his fortune, but they also shaped the burdens his family would inherit. The man behind the fortune: faith, failure, and redemption. Long before Phil Robertson became a cultural force, he was a man on the brink of losing everything. Few fans of Duck Dynasty ever knew the darker years that nearly destroyed his family. In his 20s and early 30s, Phil struggled with alcohol, violence, and a temper that left deep scars on his marriage. Kay, who married him at just 17 after becoming pregnant with their first child, held their home together through tears and prayer. According to Phil's own accounts in later interviews, he abandoned his family for days at a time, consumed by heavy drinking and reckless behavior. The family lived in constant uncertainty, unsure if he would return home sober, angry, or not at all. Then came the turning point. One day, in a small church in West Monroe, Phil walked in restless and defiant, and walked out a changed man. He embraced Christianity with a level of conviction that would define every decision he made for the rest of his life. From that moment, he rebuilt his marriage, apologized to his children, and channeled his energy into working, providing, and teaching. His Christian conversion didn't just reshape his life, it reshaped the entire Robertson family. Faith became the center of everything he touched: the family business, the books he wrote, the speeches he delivered, and the podcast Unashamed that he hosted with Jace and Al. On that podcast, Phil spoke the same way he lived: straightforward, unapologetic, and anchored in Scripture. Even in his final months, as Alzheimer's slowly stole parts of him, his words remained unusually clear. Listeners couldn't believe he was as sick as his children claimed. His voice sounded steady. His convictions were unchanged. This was the version of Phil Robertson his family honored in his will, not the millionaire, not the TV star, but the man who had risen from his own failures and spent decades living out the faith he preached. The fortune he left behind was real, but the redemption that built that fortune was the part that made his family cry. The farewell that marked the end of an era. As the family absorbed the emotional weight of the will, another realization settled over them. Phil Robertson's death was more than a personal loss. It marked the end of a generation. Phil came from a time and culture that no longer exists in the same way. Self-made Southern entrepreneurs who built their lives with their hands, trusted in God above all, and resisted the influence of modern culture. His passing closed the final chapter of that era for the Robertsons. After his Alzheimer's diagnosis became public in December 2024, fans across America began preparing for the inevitable. But within the family, the decline was faster than they expected. By early April 2025, Jace revealed on Unashamed that Phil was not good, adding, "We're making him comfortable, and we're doing the best we can." Despite that, Phil still recorded a few final podcast episodes where his voice sounded almost untouched by the disease. Those recordings now feel like a final gift, a last message from a man who always spoke with certainty. The private funeral held after his death on May 25, 2025, reflected exactly who Phil was. No politicians, no celebrities, no cameras, just a quiet gathering of his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and a small circle of locals who had been part of his life long before fame arrived. There was laughter between tears, Bible readings, and long silences that carried the weight of shared history. Even as they grieved, the family moved forward with the responsibility Phil left them. Willie stepped into his new role as majority owner of Duck Commander Jace, continued the work on the podcast. Jep handled his share of the brand's legacy, and A&E prepared the revival series, Duck Dynasty, The Revival, premiering in summer 2025, the first season without Phil's physical presence, but filled with his influence. The letters in the will weren't instructions on how to manage money. They were reminders of who they were, where they came from, and what Phil expected them to uphold. That was why the family cried. Because the fortune was valuable, but the responsibility and the love behind it meant far more. What part of Phil Robertson's final message touched you the most? Tell us below. And if you want more stories about the people who shaped our culture in unforgettable ways, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for the next chapter.